Hey there, and welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. This podcast typically focuses on the garden for a good reason. But in this episode, we're going to be talking about the gardener. You, the gardener. Me, the gardener. I think this has been a piece that I'm not sure I fully recognized was something worth discussing. In my quest over the years of produce, do whatever I can to have the most healthy, most productive garden possible, I think that I have missed the fact that it's important not only to take care of our gardens, but also to take care of the gardener. So this episode is going to be very much more of a personal look into some changes that I made this year. After gardening for a specific way for 10 years, I made some significant changes this year. I'm going to talk about what those changes are. I'm going to talk about how my lifestyle changed when I changed the way that I gardened. And also, I'll be talking about what does this mean for my future garden? Because if you've heard me talk about this in previous episodes on the podcast, especially last week's episode, you know that I've really enjoyed my garden this year. So what is that going to mean for the future? And also, whether or not you decide to make any major changes in your garden next year, like I did this year, most of the time we're constantly making some type of change in our garden. We're trying to adapt and adjust and make our gardens work for us from year to year. So at the end of the episode, I'm going to be asking you some questions that will help you think through what type of garden and what type of garden lifestyle you would like to have for your garden as you move forward. So stick to the end. I'm going to be talking a lot about my experience, but then I'm going to wrap it up with some questions for you to help you out as you start planning for your garden, both in the fall and winter and in the years to come. If you listened to last week's episode, I talked a lot about different changes that I made in my garden space, what I grew, all the practical things that I changed in my garden. But in this episode, I'm going to be talking all about garden lifestyle. How did those changes impact how I lived as a gardener? Now, if you're new to the podcast or you're new to my story, you may not really recognize what a big change this was. So what I want to do is I want to summarize what my garden and what my rhythm was like for the past 10 years up to this year. Essentially, from the time that I really got serious about growing a garden in 2013 all the way through 2023, what did that look like for me? Some of this you may be able to relate to. Some of it you may not be able to relate to because it may seem a little extreme, and I admit it probably is looking back at it now, but I think it might be able to help you in different ways, just depending on your stage of your garden. Whether this is something maybe you aspire to, which I see that a lot, especially in new gardeners coming up, but hopefully you'll be able to see a few of the red flags here because I've been there, done that. But also, even if you can just see just a few things in here that I changed, I think that might be helpful for you. So let me talk about the reason I chose certain things to plant in my garden. The whole point when I started my garden as a new stay-at-home mom in 2013 was to grow as much as I could grow in my garden that we ate because I was trying to save as much money as I could on groceries. And so with that goal in mind, my thought process for a decade was if we ate it and I could grow it, as in my climate was conducive for that, then I did. It didn't matter if we only ate black-eyed peas 4 times a year. By golly, I am going to grow black-eyed peas instead of buying the 4 cans. I know that seems a little crazy now that I actually enunciate that out loud, but that was my thought process. The only thing that I wanted to buy at the grocery store were things that I was not able to grow myself or that I wasn't able to grow enough of. And even then, it was a quest to grow as much as you can for the entire year. And I'm not saying that's bad at all. It served me well. My grocery bill has not gone up like so many others. So I don't say that that's a bad thing at all. But living that kind of garden lifestyle requires quite a bit of planning, preparation, and sacrifice. It required me to be extremely diligent in planning the garden at the beginning of the year because I'm trying to grow as much as I can for my family. It required a whole lot of working in the garden because I had a lot of garden space to grow all of that food. And I had to be as efficient as I could be. I had to make the best use of all the space that I had with all the season that I had. And to be honest with you, it made me a really good gardener because I had to be planning and I had to be working. I had to be efficient. All of these things were good. And it lends well to my personality because those are the types of qualities that I have that I'm good at. I'm good at planning. I'm good at working hard. I'm good at being efficient. So it kind of played into my personality in general, and it made it where I was successful. But like anything in life, like any good thing, there are some drawbacks. So this is what my life looked like, especially during the summer, sometimes in the spring, but especially during the summer, especially when my kids were home from school. I mean, I'm thinking about those types of things too. In the morning, I would wake up right at the crack of dawn, which was usually like 5:30 or so, just because I'm like a chicken. It seems like I'll get up when the sun rises, no matter what it is. But I would get up early, which is typical for me. I would get my coffee. I would read my Bible. That's just part of my regular routine in the morning. But as soon as those routines were done, I was out in the garden in the morning. Part of that was because we live in Arkansas and it's hot and humid during the day. And so the best times to work in the garden are in the mornings and in the evenings. So the first thing I would do is I would get up, and many days by 7 a.m. I would be in the garden and I would work until it got too hot. Sometimes that was 9, sometimes that was 10. Not very often would I go past 10 just because in the middle of the summer it would get too hot for that. But that was what I would spend my mornings doing. And then whenever it got too hot, I would come inside and I would take a shower. And then at that point, I would start working on the podcast, blog, my job here to create content for you in the form of online courses and free downloads and everything that you've probably seen if you've been around here very long. So I would do that mainly in the mid-morning to the early afternoon. And then during peak garden season, I would spend my afternoon canning, hours worth of canning, and then I'd have to cook dinner. And then after dinner, I would go back into the garden. So whenever it got cool enough to handle, usually probably about 7 o'clock in the evening, depending on the time of year, but usually I would work till dark, which in Arkansas, dark, especially in the peak time of year, is about 9. So I would work until about 9 o'clock at night. And then by the time I got inside, got another shower, then it's time to go to bed. So that was pretty much my daily rhythm during the summer. And it was a lot. It was a lot for sure. And as you can imagine, I was exhausted, but I felt a huge sense of accomplishment. That is something that I can't deny, especially with all the canned goods that I had, with all the dinners that we would make in the summer, and it was fresh from the garden, where the only thing that we had on our plate that wasn't from the garden was the meat. Then that was a huge amount of accomplishment. And especially in the wintertime when I had all of those foods preserved, all the work was worth it. But still, for those weeks in the summer, it was exhausting. And as you can imagine, especially in the summer, when everybody thinks about summer as being the lazy days of summer, or just, you think of something of summer being so fun, my life in the summer revolved around the garden. I just remember it being a sacrifice to choose to take my kids to the pool, like to swim, or to meet a friend for coffee. And many times I had to say no just because I had pounds and pounds of tomatoes waiting for me and they couldn't wait any longer. And while I desired to do those things, I just couldn't. And I remember starting to feel this resentment in the last few years because I would see friends of mine that would be going on hikes, or they would just up and take their kids somewhere. And I would think, that must be nice. And I started thinking, yes, it is nice for them to be able to take hikes, or to take their kids swimming, or to be able to go tubing on the lake. We have a lake that's right in our city, without thinking about all the to-do things that I was missing, that all I was going to have to get behind on. And I started realizing I don't need to be resentful. I don't need to be resentful that I can't do these things while my kids are still at home. And as they've been growing, I've been realizing my time with them is short. And so I started realizing that maybe I had gone a little extreme. And when my kids were really little, I don't think it affected me as much, just because they required so much hands-on care in general when they were little. So I was spending a lot of time with them here and there. But as they got older and as they got more independent, I feel like in some ways I got more focused on my garden. And it was just one of those things that I realized wasn't quite in balance like I wanted. And all that to say, I'm sharing this with you because this may seem extreme because many of you, this is not your life and you don't want it to be your life. So it's hard to relate. And I completely understand. But for some people, this is the life that you want because you want to be able to grow as much food as you can for your family. But why I'm sharing this with you is to share with you that to be able to grow as much food as you can for your family, it is going to require sacrifice. And it may be more than you're ready to give, or maybe you're ready to throw it all in and be like, yes, I'm in. Then I want you to go in with your eyes open to know that it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and you're going to have to revolve your life around your garden for a good portion of the year, depending on your garden season. But even if you don't relate to much of this, I think that you can possibly relate if you find yourself starting to feel tired, discouraged, resentful. That's one of those things that if I feel resentment coming up, I feel like I need to dig down. Why am I resentful? And this is something that even if your lifestyle didn't look like mine, maybe you can relate to some of the emotions. And that brings me to why changed? What changed this year? Why did this year change? And if you're not new around here, this isn't going to come as a surprise. But what ended up happening last year was in February, I injured my back. It ended up being a herniated disc and I had to go to physical therapy. I had gone to my neurosurgeon fearing that I'd have to have a second back surgery. I had back surgery back in 2015. Thankfully, physical therapy and the grace of God worked and I did not have to have surgery. But there was a few months there that I wasn't able to do a whole lot in my garden. I had to depend on my family to plant the entire spring garden because I couldn't bend over to do anything. My back was so injured. And it really was kind of a literally and figuratively come to Jesus moment because I was like, is this the life I'm supposed to be living like this? Knowing that I injured my back in my garden and now I can't garden. Now what? And so it was a big pivotal turning point. And I felt like I needed to change. I needed to do something just for this year, for 2024. I needed to take a break. I had been gardening so hard and so long for 10 years, and I needed to take a break. So what I did this year is I made some changes. Number one, I have a mixture, and we talked about this last week, so I won't go too much into it, but I have a mixture of raised beds, my ground bed, and my containers, and I decided this year not to have any in-ground space. I talked about that more in last week's episode if you haven't listened to it yet. So what that meant was I took out all my in-ground gardens. Well, I didn't take them out. I just didn't plant in them. And instead, I focused on my raised beds, which are way less work. And so what that ended up subtracting was about 200 square feet of garden space in the ground is what I was able to remove by not growing in the ground. And instead, I focused on my raised beds, but also in my kitchen garden, which I shared about that last week too. And I replaced with that in-ground garden was about 200 square feet. The raised beds that I added were about 80 square feet, I'd say. So I still downsized, but when you replace ground bed space with raised bed space, it is not a one-to-one. In my experience, raised beds are way less work. And so to me, that was a lot less work. Even though the square footage wasn't that different, a whole lot less work. Another thing that I did besides focusing on the kitchen garden area is I planned more succession plantings because my goal wasn't to can everything and to preserve everything. I'm going to go into that a little bit more as we talk in this episode, but because I wasn't doing as much canning, I still wanted to grow a whole lot of food. That has not ever changed. I love being able to grow my own food in my garden, but I wanted to grow more in fresh, to be able to harvest fresh. And so what I had to do there is to grow in succession. Now that took more strategic planning, because if I'm going to grow in succession, which means I'm going to plant a crop and then harvest and then plant again and just continue having crops coming on throughout the year, then that takes a little bit more planning. So I had to be more strategic about that. But thankfully, I had the years of experience that I knew my climate well. I knew when things could be planted and when they could do well in general. So that just took a little extra time, but it didn't take as much work as it would have if I were a beginning gardener starting to just getting to know my climate, if that makes sense. So I de-emphasized canning as my default. I really decided not to can a whole lot. Specifically, I didn't can tomatoes. I did not even grow or can green beans. I didn't grow or can black-eyed peas or shelling peas, green peas. So that was really my focus, is if I canned anything, I wanted it to be because I wanted to do it, not because I had to do it to be able to stock my pantry. In the past, it's like, put it all up, put it all on the shelf, make use of every single thing that comes out of your garden and find a way to preserve it. That was my previous mindset. And now, since canning wasn't my default, the things that I did choose to can, I chose to do because I wanted to, and I made it work in the context of my day. It wasn't so much like I was just, okay, what am I going to can today? Because I got to get it all done. So the mindset for sure changed. Now, though, looking back at this season, how did these changes affect my day-to-day? That's the biggest question, and it's a question I'm asking myself. What has my day-to-day look like that's different than the past 10 years? Well, the main thing is I am not gardening at every opportunity. Before, whenever I could in the morning and in the evenings, and even if it was pretty on an afternoon and it didn't want to kill me with heat, I would be out there taking advantage of every little margin of time that I had. This time I didn't do that. I actually had time to do other things. I've been taking walks in the mornings and in the evenings. I've been able to ride bikes with my husband more than I've been able to in the past, or at least do it without feeling guilty that I should be in the garden instead of riding a bike. I have been watching a lot of baseball at night. You heard me talk about how I've rekindled my love for the Atlanta Braves. I've been a fan since I was a little girl, and I just haven't, up until a couple years ago, I really hadn't followed them as much. But now my husband for Mother's Day got me a subscription to MLB TV. So almost all the Braves games are on TV. So I've been able to enjoy that in the evening, which is something that it brings me joy. I've been able to walk with my friends. I've been able to meet a friend for coffee every other week. We study the Bible together, and that's just been so life-giving to me. But those are some of the things that I would not have made time for before. And I know that that seems strange. And if you are the type that, or if you haven't given your whole life to gardening yet, then this may seem extreme that I'm telling you, wow, I can actually have coffee with a friend every other week. But it was a big thing for me. So this was probably the biggest nugget of joy I found, is that I've been able to have a more balanced life. But that didn't mean that I don't garden. I absolutely do. But the difference is that I garden mostly when I want to, not feeling like I have to, or I need to, or this needs to be done and that needs to be done. But instead, on a Saturday morning, wow, it's beautiful outside. I'm up early anyway, just because I'm a morning person, and I can't wait to go outside and just piddle in my garden. I don't think I ever piddled in my garden for 10 years. It was all like, what can I do to make this more productive? But instead, it's productive piddling, don't get me wrong, cutting off the early blight from the tomato plants and deadheading some of the flowers, and thankfully not a whole lot of weeding. Truthfully, having raised beds, I don't know that I've spent really any time weeding, quite honestly. So it's been enjoyable things, planting succession plantings, just being able to be outside and enjoy my garden. That has just been incredible. I didn't realize that part of me had been desiring to come out for so long. So that's been such a good thing. Another thing, though, that is something I didn't plan on, but it just kind of happened, is even though I didn't plant enough plant enough crops to put up to can for the most part. I mean, I am canning some things like pickled beets, and I've done some pickles and that kind of thing, banana peppers, but I haven't had the whole like canning's my life thing. I've had extras still out of my garden that I don't really know what to do with because I'm not going to be canning as much as I used to. Cucumbers have been an incredible harvest this year, more than ever. But what I've been able to do is give away more. This really was something that hit me because my mother-in-law takes care of her mother who's in her 80s, and she lives alone with some assistants, but there's other people in her apartment complex that are elderly. And my mother-in-law said, hey, if you have any extras that you just don't know what to do with, let me know. And she and I were talking about these, her mother and her neighbors, and talking about how they really struggle for food. And I mean, I had heard that, we all hear that, but it kind of hit more home when it was someone close to me telling me this. And I said, well, do they not have Meals on Wheels? And she said, oh, they have Meals on Wheels, but they don't normally get fresh food, like not fresh produce. And my heart just sank because I know this is a reality. I've heard about it, but like I said, just being in proximity to it, it hit me differently. And so I was thinking about these women who could probably teach me how to garden. These are women probably in their, 70s, 80s maybe. They grew up in a generation where they knew how to garden. They knew how to cook things. They knew how to cook their produce. They knew how to can, but they just didn't have it and they didn't have the ability. And so just to be able to send the extras, which hadn't been a whole lot, but to be able to send some extras with my mother-in-law to give to them, she said that they were just delighted. And I just say that because that was not something that was really ever on my radar, because my goal was to feed my family, which is not a bad goal, but this has been able to allow me to think past that and to think beyond just my family and think about, Jill, are you really going to use all those cucumbers? You put up all the pickles that you want. Start giving it away, So I realized that, and that's become honestly kind of a faith thing with the Lord in me, because I felt like him prodding me. Don't you have enough, Jill? You have enough. I've provided enough. Now give it. And that may be going beyond really what you came to listen to, but it was definitely a heart thing for me. And it's been enjoyable to be able to see that part of it that I hadn't really honestly made room for in 10 years because I was so focused on our family. So that's how my lifestyle changed. That's how my garden changed. And now I am at the point of, okay, so this was supposed to be a 1-year thing. This whole not canning much, this was supposed to be a 1-year Sabbath, so to speak. Not that it was a true Sabbath because I'm still in my garden, but hopefully you get the point. It was a change. But what does this mean for next year? The thing is that I don't know. I am honestly not sure what my garden is going to look like next year. At this point, I don't have any desire to can tomatoes right now, but I also still have a plethora of stock from last year. Last year was a bumper crop tomato season, and then I knew at the time of canning those tomatoes that I was going to take this year off, so I canned as much as I could to try to get stocked up to possibly last 2 years. And so I haven't run out of that, and I'm not anywhere near running out of that. So in my mind, I'm thinking, no, I haven't missed canning tomatoes at all, but I also have had the results of past years. So once my stock is gone, am I going to miss it? Am I going to want it again? So that's possibly true. And maybe that's what it's going to take. Maybe it's going to take me running out for me to find that motivation to get back to canning tomatoes, because I love the finished product, but actually canning hundreds of pounds of tomatoes is a lot of work. And that's pretty much what my whole entire July has been spent doing for the past 10 years. So to be able to have a July without having all of that was really enjoyable. So I'm not quite sure where that leaves me, but I will say I still enjoy canning. It's not something that I want to leave completely, because I have enjoyed canning the things that I have been able to do. A couple of things I've been thinking about, especially as I've looked at my stock in both canning and in dehydrating, is a lot of these foods will last 2 years and maybe even a little bit longer. So I've started thinking, and this is something that I'm just still playing around with in my head, could I choose a crop to focus on each year instead of doing it all every year? The way that I would do it before is I would, try to grow everything. Tomatoes, green beans, black-eyed peas, everything I could possibly preserve, I would do it all in that same year. But would it be easier to focus on, like last year I had enough green beans to can for at least 2 years. Maybe next year I do green beans to last 2 years and have it like an every other year type thing where I've got, one really heavy duty not hard crop, but time intensive canning crop like tomatoes 1 year. And then, the next year it'll be a different one. Maybe that would be a rhythm. The only risk in that is that tomatoes, especially in my climate, are kind of unreliable in the fact that last year we had a bumper crop because the weather cooperated, but the year before that we had heat and drought and we had a low year. So if it's the year to can tomatoes and we have a bad weather year, that's kind of a risk. But that's something that I'm definitely considering. Another thing that I'm really trying to think about, especially as I'm walking my garden, is to consider what I would miss. I want to switch from the have to the want to mindset, from the I can do this to the I want to do this mindset. And kind of going back to what I said before, I had to ask myself, would I miss having home canned black-eyed peas? Well, we eat it like 4 times a year. So would I really miss it if I had to buy those 4 cans at the grocery store as opposed to going through the effort? Those are crops that I would typically grow in the ground, so it's a lot more work. And then harvesting them and shelling them and then canning them. I mean, it's a process. But if I bought those at the grocery store, would that be okay? I don't know that I would miss the homegrown. Now, that's just an example for me because many of you grow black-eyed peas, especially in the South, that maybe you can't get at the grocery store and you love a certain variety and you love growing them. That would be your thing, but for us, maybe not. For me, would I miss fresh cucumbers? Yes, I would miss fresh cucumbers. I love having fresh cucumbers. So that's one thing that, if you want to ask yourself, what would you miss? And that kind of goes down into the questions I'm going to prompt you to at the end of this is what would I miss? And then switching from the I have to do this or I can grow this, so I should, switching from that to I want to grow this. I can grow this and I want to. Another thing I want to look at is I really enjoy my kitchen garden. I love having all my crops right outside my door. I talked about that a lot last week. So what does that mean for my large garden? At the time of this recording, my husband and I are still talking about that because we just are not sure. And another thing I'm looking at is I want to consider the stage of my life with my kids. My son is now a senior in high school. He's 18. My daughter is 14. She's an 8th grader. So he'll probably go to college locally, so he'll still be home, but still he's an adult and getting ready to be, not my little boy anymore, already is to some degree. And my daughter, I have 5 years left until she graduates. And knowing that time is ticking down makes me look at things a little differently. That yes, I don't have to be as hands-on with them as I was when they were little, but being emotionally available and physically present when they need me is something that I need to not take for granted. Just because they don't have to have me to do everything for them anymore doesn't mean I'm any less needed at this stage of my life. And I know that in 5 short years, what does that look like? And maybe for me, it needs to look like my garden needs to have a specific place in my life. And I need to give it boundaries because I really need to make sure that I make the most of the time that I have with my kids while they're still home. And then once empty nest comes, and many of you guys that are empty nesters can give me some advice here, maybe at that point I go back to a big garden if I have the physical stamina for it. I don't know, but for right now, I think I need to put some boundaries in my garden so that I can really be available for my kids at this stage of their life, especially my daughter having, 5 more years with me. So those are some things that I'm thinking about. I know many moms that are at an earlier stage of parenthood listen to this. And so I just want to share that with you. So to summarize here, these are just some things that I've thought about. Number one, I don't regret 10 years of working my tail off in the garden. I don't regret it. I became a good gardener. I loved it. When my kids were young, it gave me something to focus on that me as a driven person I needed. Parenting does not give you the immediate yield like a crop of tomatoes does. And so for me, having gone from being a working mom for 10 years to a stay-at-home mom where you don't always see the results of your labor, the garden was the outlet that I needed. And for sure, it helped provide for our family, and it helped provide for our grocery bill just in the garden itself. So I don't regret that at all. It was right for me at that stage of my life. And I feel like I needed this back injury to some degree for me to realize that just because that was right for me at that stage of my life does not mean that that's what's right for me in every stage of my life. And the next thing is that I've noticed that I've lost some of that desire and motivation, specifically when it comes to growing it all and canning it all and preserving it all. And my question is, will that come back? Maybe. But I honestly think for it to come back, I need to miss it a little more. I need to be away from it enough so that that desire can be rekindled if it does. And I need to be okay with maybe it won't. That's okay. But that's something I have to recognize, that if I'm not desiring it as much as I did before, then maybe I need to lean into that instead of just eking it out. I want to find joy in my garden. And that's the thing. The desire to garden is still there 100%. That is something that has not changed. I still love going out in my garden. I actually love working in my garden, as I mentioned, more than ever. I love spending a few hours on my Saturdays working in the garden. I love having the space, the time to be able to make it what I want, and for not feeling like I've got to do this and that, and basically being captive to the tyranny of the urgent. So what is my garden? What is it going to look like next year? As I mentioned, I'm not sure. I might need to keep it on the lighter side again next year. I'm part of it. My son will be a senior in the spring, so maybe that's my focus. I've heard about how busy families are when their kids are seniors. So this is all new to me, so I might need to make it a little bit lighter next year. But then keeping these things in mind, this is one thing that I want to make sure to remember as I move into fall and winter and begin planning my garden again, because I do start planning my garden in January. So I definitely want to keep all of these things in mind as far as my lifestyle and what changes had been made as I start planning next year. To conclude then, here are some questions I promised I want to prompt you with. These are some things that I want you to ask yourself when it comes to your garden lifestyle, you as a gardener. And I think these questions, if you can answer them, maybe even write them down and reflect on them a little bit. If you're in the garden right now, after I ask the question, pause and then just look at your garden and think through some of these things. I really think it will help you as you are trying to figure out what direction you want to go next year. First, what did you enjoy this year? What brought you joy? Those things are things you want to lean into. What you absolutely loved doing or harvesting, what brought you joy. Number 2, what drained you? Are there certain activities that drain you? Was there a certain time of year that drained you? And if that's the case, is it something that you just are okay with? Hey, this is going to be a busy season, kind of like I've spent my Julys doing for 10 years, and then it'd be worth it? Or is it something that you want to consider letting go of or backing off of? I think what drains you as a gardener is very telling, just like what you enjoyed. Number 3, what would you miss? If you decided not to grow a garden at all, which honestly, that has never even crossed my mind, but I know it crosses a lot of people's minds and I understand it. But if that were to happen, what would you miss? And that may actually help you to know what you want to keep. That's one thing that I've been looking at myself. What would I miss? Have I missed growing black-eyed peas? Not in the slightest. Have I missed growing green beans this year? No, not at all. I mean, I've still got them canned. If I ran out of them canned, would I miss them? Maybe. What would you miss? I would miss certain things in my garden for sure. And those are the things that might clue you in on what you for sure want to keep. The next thing, what would you have to change for whatever it is in your garden, in your life, to be better? So whether that is your garden in particular or it's your garden as a lifestyle, what would you have to change for it to be better? So for example, for me, the feeling like I didn't even have a July in the middle of my summer because I was so exhausted from canning, what would I have to change for July to be better? Well, take away canning tomatoes, and that was a huge, huge help for me this year. So ask yourself that question. The next thing is, what could you add to make XYZ easier? For me, watering was a huge thing. My garden has been so much more enjoyable when I've put more of my garden on automation, like my drip irrigation system with Garden in Minutes, and also my drip lines on my grow bags. Having all that on a timer where I don't have to hand water has made gardening in general easier. That's just one example, but think about your garden in general. What could you add to make whatever it is easier? Another thing that I was able to do this year, and in that last year a little bit too, is my nephew has been coming over a couple of hours a week. I pay him to do some of the more manual labor tasks that just are aggravating to me, quite frankly. And they're tasks that I put him in charge of things that I know is going to be a little harder on my back because I still want to be real careful with my back. So shoveling compost and topping off beds with compost, filling raised beds, I'm pretty much having him do that. So that was something that I added to make those things easier. So that's another question you could ask. And answering these questions now, if you're in your garden, you're pausing and you're thinking about this, answering these questions now will give you more realistic guidance as you plan in the next season. I think that's what has been very helpful for me, especially this year, has been just to walk my garden and contemplate these things, knowing that garden is a huge part of my life, but I want to make it where it's a different part of my life, not so much the driving force, but more of a complement, something that I find joy in again. And that was something that it took a change in the way that I gardened to be able to see those things. I hope that this has been helpful for you in looking at this more personal look in my garden. I know many of you have been following along with me. A lot of this is not going to come as a surprise, but as you've been following along, especially since last year, so many of you guys were so encouraging when I was in the middle of my back injury, and that was a really dark time. I wasn't really sure what was going to happen, but following along with all of this, hopefully it'll help you to be able to apply some of these reflections to your own garden and what you want out of it so that it can make your garden a more enjoyable experience and productive. We can have both, but it's trying to figure out how to make one without the expense of the other. And that's where I'm at in my garden. So make sure and join along with me as you see me trying to wrestle with some of these things, even as we head into next year. But one thing that I have found that has made gardening easier and has enhanced my gardening life has been the fall garden, and has been actually planting some crops in the fall that I know I won't start to harvest until next year. And that's perennial crops, planting some perennial food crops in the fall to be able to harvest earlier. And that's what we're going to be talking about in next week's podcast episode. I've actually never talked about this before, partly because I was still trying it myself. And now I've got a couple of examples I can give for you. And I hope that you will tune in so that you can learn some opportunities you have to be able to plant once and then enjoy for years to come. So if you're not yet, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast, and I will chat with you again next week. Thank you so much for joining me today.